Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, senior editor at Forbes. House Republicans are considering the sale or swap of thousands of acres of public land out in the West. What does this mean for the land in the areas being considered? Joining us to discuss is an environmental lawyer and founder of her own boutique environmental law practice, Jennifer Novak. She is an expert in this space, and we are so happy she joins us to break down this issue. Jennifer, thank you so much for being here. So let's start at the beginning. The sale of public lands is an often controversial proposal. How did this even get on the table?
This goes back a very long time, especially if you look at the fact that a great proportion of the Western United States is actually owned by the federal government. You're talking about 80% of the state of Nevada, about 60% of the state of Utah. And it goes way back to when the United States was taking land and then enticing people to move out west with the Homesteading Act. So ever since then, the federal government has been holding on to a lot of land, some of which has been turned into parks or refuges, some of which is just not being used. And so when you have any sort of commodity or property like that, there is always a temptation to try to make it into something economically useful. And we've had to balance these considerations for a very long time between conservation and public use versus mining or housing or other things that we might use that land for.
Now, this is part of overall budget negotiations. What is the thesis financially here? How much could this help the budget if these parcels were sold?
I haven't seen an exact dollar amount given to these particular parcels that we're talking about right now, but it goes a little bit beyond that. There's the one-time sale, but then potentially there's also the types of materials that could be extracted from some of these lands and money paid to the federal government for that purpose as well. It also plays into economics in the sense that what you're talking about are some counties and cities in Nevada and Utah that really feel like they're hemmed in, that they can't expand further. They won't have the opportunity to attract more jobs and more people and build more infrastructure because they're surrounded by federal land. So, from an economic standpoint, that's a consideration for them as well.
Part of the controversy here, or at least something that I see being reported by local media in Nevada and Utah, is the time of day that this proposal came onto the table, so to speak. So, Jennifer, can you break down the middle of the night aspect to this and whether or not that is terribly rare in a case like this?
Sure. What had happened is that the House Republicans on the Natural Resources Committee had been signaling that they were not going to consider a land sale as part of the budget negotiations. And then at the last minute, without signaling that it was possible, without accepting public comment or letting it come out into the press, it was added before it was passed. So it was seen as one of those situations where you usually don't do that kind of activity unless you're trying to bury something or sneak something in that you think is going to be incredibly unpopular. So it's not that it is particularly uncommon. It was more that it may have signaled that the House Republicans understood that most Americans actually like the federal public lands and want to protect them, and that this was not going to be seen as something that people wanted to have done.
So does that mean, legally speaking or constitutionally speaking, there's now no opportunity for public comment or for folks to call their congresspeople if they live near one of these parcels and have concerns?
Well, this is only the first step. It was the Natural Resources Committee making its proposals for the overall national budget. So there is still an absolute opportunity for people to weigh in and tell their representatives whether or not they like this idea. And I will note that there was one Republican on the committee who voted no, and more prominently, Congressman Ryan Zinci, who actually used to be the Secretary of Interior during the first Trump administration, despite the fact that he's from Montana, not Nevada or Utah, basically said he was drawing a line in the sand and that he would not, 100% not, pass any budget that included the sale of federal lands.
Is that because it would create some sort of precedent in Utah and Nevada that could then be used in Montana? Was that part of his thesis?
There is a concern that, especially when we look at some of the more recent executive orders that President Trump has signed, that maybe we're shifting away from preservation of federal lands for the sake of all Americans and all visitors to a privatization. And once we start down that slippery slope, I think a lot of people are afraid that we will start to open more and more land in more and more states. And if you're somebody who is one of the millions of people who do bird watching, fishing, hunting, camping, or are in an industry that relies on the tourism that those kinds of activities can create, you are concerned about this not being just a very small thing, but instead starting to open up the floodgates.
You mentioned birding, fishing, people who visit nature. It looked like one of these parcels was somewhat near Zion National Park. What else is this land currently being used for, and what is the proposal on the table in terms of how it could be used after a swap or sale?
Sure. So, as an example, the city of St. George came out in favor of this proposal because their argument is they are expanding rapidly and they need that land. Interestingly, among the things they advocated for was the possible need to expand their water reclamation plant. They might need to expand their airport. They wanted to protect some land around a creek. And maybe some of that land might be used for housing. So it really seems like it's going to be up to the county or the municipality involved as to how that public land is going to be used. And so we can't entirely trust people who say it will only be used for housing or it only has to be used certain ways. We often see a mismatch between where these federal lands are and where we need that development and infrastructure and growth.
I was just about to ask about legal precedent, obviously acknowledging that all 50 states are different and what happens in one state isn't necessarily prescriptive for what happens in another. But in your experience as an environmental lawyer, what does typically happen if public land is swapped for private use?
Generally speaking, there's a review process so that the land has been studied and identified. And in fact, under federal law, Congress is supposed to be, in the Bureau of Land Management, are supposed to be balancing a number of competing interests, everything from grazing and energy use to conservation, um, and public enjoyment. And what we're seeing right now is without studying those lands, we don't have any evidence to show that they are otherwise not useful or they are otherwise more useful to do mining or housing or some other activity versus the hunting, the birding, the preservation, the open space, or even many tribes depend on the lands we're talking about for purposes of protecting their sacred spaces. So one possible way of legal challenge is to note the fact that this seems to be random. This does not seem to be necessarily studied or well guided. And without understanding why these lands in particular are needed for these purposes over and above all other uses, you don't have a good basis for being able to move forward. I'll also note that we do have a variety of environmental laws, such as the National Environmental Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, that President Trump can't simply waive with an executive order. It would have to be an act of Congress that says that you don't have to comply with all the permitting or review requirements that many of these laws require.
I was about to ask about legal challenges, but I'm also curious about what this says writ large about the Trump administration's policy on environmentalism. Let's start with those legal challenges. Are there any on the books right now, or are folks still kind of organizing and determining whether it makes sense to file suit?
Well, it's still really early in the process. We would still need to see whether or not the budget is passed and signed into law by the president. And at that point in time, we would start to see some challenges, I'm assuming, from some environmental groups and maybe even others. So that would be, I don't know, a ways down the road. But what we do have are some examples of situations where there have been proposed land purchases or swaps in the past. For example, in 2014, there was one involving an Apache tribe where Congress decided they would open up some of the land that the tribe deemed sacred. And they brought a variety of challenges within the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals here in the West, it's still going on. And in fact, is currently in front of the United States Supreme Court. And just last week, a federal district court judge issued a temporary injunction saying that while that case is pending in front of the Supreme Court, um, the mining can't go forward and the land swap can't occur until these are resolved legally.
Oh, wow. So when do we expect a Supreme Court decision in that case?
Um, Honestly, I didn't look to see whether or not I was on the books yet as far as oral argument. I do know that the federal court decision at the district court level was just last week to give some time for the tribe to challenge the decision of the Ninth Circuit that was not in their favor. And interestingly, it was based on religious grounds that the land swap couldn't happen because it violated their sacred space and their ability to practice religion as they see fit.
That makes sense as both a logical and a legal argument. So what we have here, it sounds like, is the proposed sale or swap of public land in Nevada and Utah as part of the budget proceedings, and then separately a Supreme Court case considering another parcel of land. What does all of this activity around the sale or swap of public land say to you about how this administration is treating environmentalism in 2025?
We have a lot of indications about how this administration is going to proceed based both on the first Trump administration as well by the rapid fire executive orders that we have seen this time around. I will say that one difference is that in March, President Trump issued an executive order that basically directed the agencies to streamline permitting, to designate mining and mineral exploration as the number one use for public lands, forgoing all the others, as well as trying to identify what the best parcels would be to open up for more mineral exploration. We've also seen an executive order in which President Trump suggested that the government has the ability to designate pretty much anything as a mineral and opening up the mineral exploration, not just for things that are deemed critical minerals, critical to our energy consumption and also the rare earth minerals that we've been talking about a lot in the news, but to more common things like gold and coal. So it seems as if the idea of the one-time sale for a cash influx, as well as the potential to get some royalties from some of the exploration, are seen as more of the driver economically than, for example, the tourism industry or the people who sell sporting equipment to the people who go boating or camping or fishing, which is often forgotten when we're trying to look at competing economic interests.
That's a very fair point because often I think of public land and open space as just kind of free and people go, but there is a tourism impact, as you said. What is the environmental impact of these parts of land being turned into something else? Is there a carbon output figure that you look towards? Is there something tangible, or is it just part of the overall treatment of the environment in the US that then gets pulled down a notch, if you will?
Sure. Well, one of the quotes I often use is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And when we're talking about our open spaces and whether we should allow them to be used for oil and gas or mining, a lot of times people are not factoring in the fact that these are polluting industries. And they're industries we need because we rely on the energy, we rely on those materials. But what can often happen is at the end of the day, when the resource has been extracted, we are left with an environmental mess behind. And there are examples from all over the country, you know, where, for example, in California here, we have what was called the Iron Mountain mine, which is now leaching sulfuric acid from gold mining, iron ore mining, and is $1 billion problem that has been going on for decades. Many other states have similar problems. And so what we forget is that sometimes there is a societal cost where the taxpayers end up paying to keep toxic material away from fish, to protect rivers, and to keep material out of our air and our drinking water that could poison us. So when I, as an environmental lawyer, are looking at these issues, I want to be sure that we're picking the right places that are not going to adversely affect people or habitat, and that we are doing it in a responsible way so that a company doesn't come in, take the resources, and leave behind a huge mess that ultimately will cost the taxpayers in the end.
Now, when you said earlier that this provision kind of came up late in the night, overnight, as some have described it, and very quickly without any analysis, is what you just said part of any analysis that could happen? Would Congress take a look at the population centers nearest these parts of land or the environmental impact if a mining operation was put in? Or what is that part of what could be studied or would be studied?
Absolutely. So the NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, would require an environmental review, and it would ask those very questions. What would the noise impacts be? What would the air quality impacts be? What would the water quality impacts be? And this doesn't always mean that every exploration of land is going to create a huge mess, or there may be ways to mitigate it, or there may be some safety measures that could be put on. But that's the very reason why we have some of these environmental laws, which is to ensure that we are gaining an understanding in advance of what could happen, and we are planning for it to try to minimize the impacts on the back end so that we can have activities to generate the energy that we need every day. And at the same time, we're not just doing it so recklessly that we don't care about the impacts to the environment or to people after the fact.
Now, of course, recognizing that adding pollutants to a parcel of land is bad for public health writ large, I do want to ask if someone is watching this and living in a population area where there's no public land nearby, or they don't think there is. I'm speaking to you from New York City. I could not tell you where the closest public land is. Perhaps that's bad on my geography. But for folks who think that this is a Utah problem or a Nevada problem or a Montana problem, and because they're in the Northeast or somewhere else where they don't know where the closest parcel of public land is, what would you tell them?
I would tell them the purpose of having these public lands is for everyone to enjoy. And we have national parks throughout the United States. We have refuges throughout the United States. We have protected space, even where you don't think they exist. So even though the heavy concentration are in the states and areas that we've been discussing, the fact is that they are there for the benefit of the entire United States. And just because we are going to open some of them up to benefit a few cities or counties in a certain local area does not mean that someone from someplace else in the country would not find those areas really beautiful and want to use them in a different way.
Very fair point. We've covered a lot of ground. What is the immediate near-term next step in your view?
I would say we need to watch the members of Congress as to how they are planning to address this public lands issue. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of issues. Every day we're hearing about something else in the news that we can get uh, upset about or pay attention to. But with respect to this particular issue, especially for people who feel that they live in those areas, recreate in those areas, and care about those areas, letting your representatives know your feelings would be very helpful. And again, there are very slim majorities for the Republicans in both the House of Representatives as well as in the Senate. So even one or two votes no can make a huge difference if you are looking to protect those public lands.
Jennifer Novak, environmental lawyer, thank you so much for joining us and breaking down this public lands case. We so appreciate your time and your expertise.
And thank you for the opportunity.